Greetings, summoners. The topic of this video is about the outline of a session in SMTX, why it is outlined in this way, why and how Japanese tabletop RPGs follow this seemingly more rigid format compared to Western games, and what you can do as a game master to sort of read through this, understand what it's trying to do for you, and how to use it yourself. So this is on page 58. It starts with the game assumptions. This most of it is the overall game flow part that we're going to be talking about, because it just goes into rules after that. So rounding, you always round down. Unspecified rules, the GM has the final say in how rules are handled, which rules are being used, which rules are being omitted, how to handle situations that the rules don't cover. All pretty standard stuff. Now, the overall game flow. Let's see. In SMTX, the final battle often takes place in a dungeon where powerful demons await. One thing to keep in mind is, if you're familiar with SMT games, you probably know that dungeon is a rather ambiguous term. It can refer to a lot of things. It's not like a physical castle dungeon, right? But even in traditional D&D type fantasy games, dungeon, most people kind of understand that as being a location that's hostile, unexplored, in the sense that the players or whoever's worried about the dungeon, they don't really know what's going on in there per se. So you're going to go in and you'll need to be prepared for what you may encounter. And that is the name of the game, preparing for what you may encounter. That is kind of the primary underpinning foundation of this setup and the mystery occult investigation angle of SMTX that then transitions into more of a high stakes action type system whenever you're in the dungeon, handling battles, resolving the boss fight. During the dungeon attack, retreat's no longer an option, leading to intense battles. So there's a lot of... we'll cover that. So the overall flow, we see right here, we have the warm-up, openings, approaches, dungeon attack, boss battle, ending, cooldown. So the warm-up, that is preparation time before the game starts. That involves the trailer, character creation. In a lot of Japanese tabletop RPGs, the default assumption is that you are playing at a convention, or the book is always assuming that you, the reader, have never heard of or played tabletop RPGs before. This is your first time. It's all of your players' first time playing. So that's why it's always worded as like, hey, you handle character creation in the warm-up. In a lot of D&D games, I think that's kind of just a given. You gotta make a character at some point. You might as well do it before you start playing. Here, though, this is at the table. So, trailer, GM provides players with an overview, explanation of the day's game, status of the PCs. Status of the PCs, meaning their position in the story. Handouts an individual setting, so like this can be, basically you can give people a sample character, say like, here, these are your set characteristics. You know the person who is giving out the job, and then you give the other person a different character, and they can still make their own character, but they can you can also distribute set story elements. This is a very, very prominent part of pre-written scenarios in Japanese TRPGs. I'm not sure where or why this first started so prolifically. I think that because Call of Cthulhu and other mystery type games, there's no shortage of people who ask, like, how do you do puzzles or how do you do mysteries effectively at the table, right? How do you keep the story going even if you're bad at laying clues and providing all the information to get a clear picture, or if the players, by whatever quirk of their own personalities or play styles, they kill the guy that was supposed to give them the information, or they found the key but they decided not to pick it up because they were scared of it. You know what I mean? Like, how do you get past these things? Well, on the Japanese side, they just say, here, your character is this, knows this, and will do this in the story. Let's see how it actually plays out. So, trailer, as the name suggests, like a movie trailer. That, I think, kind of gives away the magician's trick, in that, indeed, the Tokita-san himself is a huge movie buff. He has a book that is fan translated by Awkward on the Sword World team of how to use film as inspiration for TRPG sessions. I need to. I think I read the first chapter, and it was pretty good. Oh, I was actually reading it with my grandmother, and we were because he's an older gentleman. He's in his 60s, so most of the movies he has in that book are older films. I think even one of them is like John Carpenter's The Thing, which is a great movie to base a TRPG session on. I don't know when he wrote the book in comparison to SMT, so I'm not sure if a lot of it's like relevant to SMT GM advice in particular. But he loves his movies, and Japanese TRPGs love to pre-write the cast and major story beats. Then you handle character creations, create the characters and ongoing campaigns. This step might be skipped. At conventions, GM might distribute pre-made characters. They cover the basics there. The warm-up is a 0 because, that's only going to happen one time at the start of a session or a scenario. However many sessions it takes to clear the scenario. If you're playing an episodic campaign, the trailer is seriously super brief. I think for my trailers, they're 1 to 2 sentences. The one in the intro replay, it's written in the format of a poem. It's not actually a poem, though. But they're just to sort of get everyone in the mood, and like a movie trailer, it's like a cutscene. It's something that gives a little bit of context and atmosphere to just get everyone ready about what may be coming. The trailer is also a very prolific aspect of pre-written scenarios. But let's get into the actual meat of the session and why it is laid out this way, and then we'll talk about each discrete scene and the units of time. A lot of this section is actually copy-pasted from Tokyo Conception. Over here in the units of time, moon phase, full moon, new moon, these have no mechanical use whatsoever in SMTX. In the conversation settings, there's something like on the full moon, dark demons don't talk to you, but you also can't talk to dark demons normally anyway. So it's just like, okay, whatever. That's it. Doesn't play into fusion, doesn't talk about how to advance moon cycles, how to track them, what they do. Like, there's no Kagatsuchi. There is, however, some mechanics in future supplements that refer to the moon phase, but they track it with a D10, kind of like a clock counter, and then once it reaches full moon, then the boss shows up. So it's very loosey-goosey, and it's practically random about when the moon phase advances, whatever. The point is, this is here. Someone might read that and be like, oh, that's cool. I wonder how that's going to be used. It isn't. A lot of things in SMTX are copy-pasted. Some of them are copy-pasted, and then they change one sentence, and it conflicts a little bit. So if you see some friction in the rules, please know that unless it's an outright typo, it is very accurate to the author's own mind, I suppose you could say. Anyways, opening. The GM explains the events leading up to the current adventure to each character or the whole party, basically saying if the party starts together, then you address the whole party. If people are starting individually by themselves, then each player would have their own opening scene, which you can see in the intro replay. Each of the 4 player characters starts on their own and very cleverly rope in the next player who's up, or they will, put a break. Like in a movie, they'll be like, I need to go get the phone and make a call, and then the scene will cut to someone else a little bit earlier, and they're playing up the scenes up until they receive the phone call. And then they do a little play about for during the phone call, and then the afterwards is sets up the launch pad for the next player. And then, of course, you can do the whole opening for the whole party. Like, hey, you're all at the diner. Classic tavern setup. I don't think it's usually best if the PCs know each other, and that's why they have the relationship tables. Just because, true to the top here, trailer movies, usually the characters they tend to skip the fumbling part in the beginning where everyone's meeting each other for the first time and there's this weird air of distrust and like, why do I want to work with you type of deal. They like to just start with like, you all know each other for these reasons. Like, this guy owes you a debt, so there's a little bit of antagonism perhaps. This person has a crush on them, or these people fought in some battle and survived together, you know. So you can absolutely do group opening or individual openings, or you can even have separate smaller group openings. I really like the openings because they give people a chance to, you know, it's a really good, serves a very, very specific purpose that the you all start in a tavern type setup also does, and it gets everyone a short little spotlight time to break the ice, kind of loosen up, get everyone looking at each other player, being like, okay, we're all playing, these are our PCs, we know each other now. You know, we stretch the vocal cords, and then once everyone's done that, we all look to the GM and say, what's next? And that's the approaches. Now, how seamlessly these transition from opening to approach will take a little bit of experience and finesse. Basically, you can expect the replay does a good job of springboarding each player's opening into the next player's opening. And at the end of it, they're all grouped up together. They all know what the objective is, and they're ready to set off and start gathering information. So it's not just on the game master, because the players themselves are typically narrating and describing the openings. So if they conclude their opening with something that is a little more isolated, and they say, this is what I do, and when I'm done doing it, I'm done doing things. And then they look to the next person or the GM and they say, now you do something. And there's not any, what's the word? There's no trailing, there's no breadcrumb to narratively steer into the approach. That's why I say it takes some experience for it to kind of seamlessly transition into the two. So it's very good idea for as the GM is responding to the players during their openings, because it's not just a monologue from the players. In fact, it even says here the GM explains the events. So it typically starts with the GM telling the player, hey, this is your situation. Hey, this is where you're at. You know, what do you want to do first? And they say, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then the GM will, if it's kind of waffling along, the GM may insert a prompt like, you know, ding, you've got a new email on your computer. You go see who it is, and it's Steven or whomever saying, hey, there's demons everywhere. And they're like, oh crap. And then the player has their call to action, and they're going to focus on that issue and probably find a way to address it somehow. In doing so, that is like, oh, well, I better not just run outside my house and go straight to the location. You probably want to get your friends first. The approaches are very interesting, and they cover the investigation part of the mystery for the session. So let's see, it says, gather information related to the current adventure and advance the story. Contacts and info skills can be used here. Combat scenes are also often included in this part. The approach consists of multiple scenes moving closer to the session's truth. This is expressed by transforming initial keywords into clue keywords. Once sufficient story development for the dungeon attack is achieved, the approach ends. Considering the progress of the game, the GM decides when to end the approach, determine in advance the number of times information gathering can be attempted before ending the approach, called cycles. This is the number of scenes each PC can attempt. So there's a lot going on there. This is where you can use info skills, contacts, also combat might happen. The approach scene, I feel, unless combats in your games run long or you have a lot of combats, the approach scenes are going to be the meat of the session and generally be the most interesting and probably where most of the focus on the prep work ought to be. The approach phase is probably where most people are going to be entering unfamiliar territory. The openings, they're a little more freeform. Approach phase, this little paragraph right here does not do nearly a good enough job at describing the full breadth of things that you can cram into the approach phase. And you'll notice that the GM, it first says the approach ends after the players have enough story development to take on the boss. This means two things, or you can interpret it two ways. This means that the approach phase lasts as long as the players need to fulfill the story, and the other way is to interpret it as, they have everything they need. They exhaust all possible avenues. And then, because in the approach phase, if you figure out who the boss is really early, you're still going to want to do preparations. So the GM shouldn't just cut the approach phase and be like, well, you know who did it, so go deal with it now. It would be in the player's best interests, in the character's best interests, to update their gear, buy consumables, call in a favor for an NPC, or maybe go do demon fusion or something to set up for the session. So with that in mind, I don't know, I'll probably have to come back to the approach phase because, like I said, it's very, very expansive what you can cram into there. It's very broad what the GM should prepare for the approaches. Then we have dungeon attack. Go to the dungeon for the final objective. This scene will involve continuous, intense battles. See combat rules, and that's it. Boss battle, the final obstacle of the mission, appears and confronts the PC as the climax of the game. Typically, it's a climax of the story in the sense that it's what you've been preparing for since the opening and the approach. You've been fighting your way through the dungeon to the boss battle, and it's the hardest challenge in the session. So it's the peak of the story, right? Not necessarily. Like the climax could be something before, something after, but typically it's easy to structure the game around the boss fight and say like that's the climax. Then the ending, you have the wrap up, you have play out scene that wraps up the story developed during the game. In this scene, the GM may prioritize the story, omit some checks. Because in the opening too, you can omit checks. Well, that's kind of what I mean is that it starts off by saying that the GM narrates this, the GM describes that, but then the players have their own input that they provide. In the opening and the ending, typically these parts of the story are there's no threat, there's no challenge, there's no time pressure. In the opening, there can kind of be a mounting sense of that kind of tension. In the ending, though, usually that's conclusion, wrap up, explanation, overview. Cooldown. So the cooldown here is where you do the character assessments. This is for alignment voting. And you can also take care of any processing like XP items, level up, that kind of deal. But one thing that I think is very neat about Japanese TRPGs is that they always dedicate time in the cooldown or wrap up or whatever's right at the end to say, get up, shake your legs a little bit, clean up the area, take care of any, bookkeeping for the character that can't be done or you wouldn't want to do at the start of the next session because you'd like to just start the next session right away. So like I said, XP leveling up, that kind of deal. And then also explicitly describes talking it out with everyone, do a recap of the game, you know, just chat. And it's very similar to the opening part of the session in the sense that, you're more breaking character. Not that you have to be in character for the whole session, but you're just loosening up, just like the opening. You're getting in the groove, you're loosening up, you're getting ready for the session, and then at the cooldown, doing the character assessments, talking about how the session went. You just, have some fun, say which parts you liked, which parts stood out to you, and it really helps the whole. Well, keep in mind too that this is still advice that's aimed at people playing at conventions or for the first time ever. So, you, if you have like a same steady group, like you probably chat outside of game nights on TRPGs and stuff. So just it's not meant to be like, okay, well the session's done, bye everyone. You know what I mean? That's the cooldown has a very specific purpose to ease everyone out of the session back into real life, and then you can part ways. All right, that will be the end of the first part in 2 or 3 parts going over the session structure. And in the next part, we'll be talking about a little bit more in depth about the scene overview itself. And in the third part, I'll be jumping into the Game Master section and continuing on the topic of the overall section structure and how it proceeds from start to finish. After that, I do intend to dive a little deeper into the specific subsystems like information gathering, approach, conversation, and how these subsystems play their part. Oh, also background music, how to use them, where to slot them in, because they're not really intended to be picked up as a procedure in the moment. They certainly can be because most of them are, 1 to 2 pages in length. So it's not the end of the world to crack open the book and go use one of those rules. But it's best if, when you're planning your scenario, you have some of these beats already planned out. And you're not just winging the whole thing, right? So it'll be outside the scope of like these first 3 parts that are just talking about the structure and flow, and then I'll get into the specific subsystems, and then I hope after that I'll sort of have enough context for anyone who's following along the videos to also then be able to follow along uh, the actual process of prepping a session for real. Thanks for watching. Until next time.